Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of Crowe Corner presentations, and I'm delighted today to be joined once again by Stephen Morley, the President of the Confederation of British Metalformers, and also our own Ian Worth, who is a Director of our Customs team. We've gathered today to talk through something that has crept through under the radar over the last couple of months from the start of October in terms of international trade. And it's probably not a surprise that it's not been on the forefront of the news because of global events. But to those that it does affect, or ought to know that it should affect, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, and also the introduction of some new Russian metal sanctions is quite significant. Ian, in the first instance, would you like to just mention what all of this is about?
Okay, I'll start with CBAM, if I may, Jonathan, thank you. So CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is an EU measure to collect charges, ultimately, on carbon content which is embedded in imported materials into the EU. There is no obligation on anybody at the point of import into the EU. And that's something I want to stress because I think that's one of the key points why this has sat below the radar for as long as it has. Now, the measure came into force on the 1st of October, and there will be a requirement for importers in the EU to submit a quarterly return starting at the end of January next year to report the levels of carbon content embedded within their products. There will be no charges levied at this stage, not until 2026, when the EU will evaluate the data which has been collected through the quarterly reporting mechanism, and at that stage they'll determine what the charges will be. These will be manifested by way of carbon certificates which will need to be purchased by importers into the EU and then surrendered against the imports that they make. There's a lot of argument as to whether this is really a customs measure and whether it sits within the customs function of a company or whether it sits within the environmental and social governance section of a company. Simple fact is that it affects all importers into the EU of affected product. And initially, affected product means iron and steel products, aluminium, cement, and electricity. There's every probability that the scope of coverage will extend in future years.
Goes up, never goes down.
Absolutely, but we don't know how much and when at this stage. It's all very much, I'm going to use the term experimental, but it's coming. It's one of the ways of the EU tackling its carbon emission obligations, and it will spread to other measures worldwide.
So forgive me, but didn't we leave the EU?
Indeed we did, and that makes the EU CBAM important to us because, of course, the EU is one of our big export markets, if not the biggest of our export markets.
So it's got a knock-on effect on export.
And what it means is that our exporters to the EU will have to provide data concerning the carbon embedded content of the products which they export to the EU.
And if exporters haven't seen that already coming in place, they certainly will do by about January, when people have to start doing these returns, I guess.
Yeah, they're going to find that their EU customers, if they haven't started already, will be asking them for data about the carbon content of their products.
And Steve, wearing your presidential hat, what has been the reaction so far from the British metal forming industry, which obviously this has got a big effect on?
He's actually one of our members who's very clued up on these things. Highlighted us probably 6 or 7 months ago this is coming. But I think the issue is that the UK government are so slow to react to this particular problem, but also EU-Russian sanctions. We just don't get the clarity of what we need in terms of answers to what we actually have to do. In the case of EU-Russian sanctions, we actually rang the Department of Business and Trade and told them there was a problem, and they said, "Oh, is that? We'll come back to you," because I didn't know. And we're fortunate to have a great policy advisor, Phil Mann, who delves into European legislation and finds these things out for us.
Let's talk a bit about those Russian sanctions. They came in on the day before, didn't they? These are EU, but there's something very similar coming in the UK too.
At exactly the same time, the 30th of September, there was a measure introduced by the EU and an almost identical measure introduced by the UK. It's not targeted at direct exports from Russia into either the EU or the UK. This is indirect exports. This is particularly iron and steel products where Russian steel or iron has been used in the manufacture of those products further downstream. Those products are then imported into either the UK or into the EU, are now prohibited if they contain Russian content in their manufacture. And that means that the importer is obliged to demonstrate that there is no Russian content within the nuts and bolts and screws that they import.
So how's that work?
Customs authorities throughout the EU are requiring that evidence is presented at the time of import to show that the imported product has been manufactured using non-Russian content within Tariff Chapter 72 or 73. That defines the scope of the measures.
And is that what I've been hearing about, this mill certificate? Is that what that's all about?
The mill test certificate is legislated, certainly within the EU legislation, but it's also referred to in UK legislation as being acceptable evidence to show where the product was manufactured and what its constituent materials are and where they came from.
What is the nature of the sanction if you haven't got that certificate?
The goods are prohibited. You're not allowed to import them, and it's an offence to import something which is prohibited, and because it's an offence which breaks a sanction, that's a criminal offence rather than a civil penalty.
So, Steve, how's this working in practice?
I think for our members, okay, actually, I think we did a lot of preparation. I was quite alarmed at the lack of action by other trade associations, even some bigger ones. We briefed our members together with Crowe in terms of the level of detail required. The mill test certificate was absolutely critical, and it actually goes back to the melt and pour of the steel, so back to the very core. And one of the problems we highlight is that a lot of scrap steel actually goes to Russia. It's important to emphasise that doesn't come back into the marketplace from Turkey or from other countries and then becomes to make a product, and then you can't get the MTC to cover that. We actually had one member who actually wrote to the steel supplier, and they actually changed their mill certificate to say not poured in Russia. So I think there has been interruption but not disruption.
Okay. And have you seen anything, Ian, from our end?
Where shipments have been stopped by customs authorities demanding to see mill test certificates and or other evidence. Thankfully, they've been able to obtain the evidence required, or alternatively, been able to prove that the goods were manufactured before the 23rd of June this year. That's the date the EU legislation was set in stone. So any imports or any goods manufactured before then can't be in scope of that measure. The first line of defence, if you like, is to prove that the goods were manufactured before the 23rd of June. This is for import into the EU. The UK doesn't have, at the moment, any such cut-off date. So regardless of age of product, it's still going to be caught by UK measures. We're waiting for clarity from the UK, but as of this moment, we still don't have that.
There could be businesses holding stock now that if they try and move it around, they might find some difficulty.
That was certainly the big fear. Once the news broke that this legislation was taking force from the 30th of September, there was quite a lot of panic throughout the sector in the UK as to, well, hang on a minute, we've got old stock going back years, is that going to be caught? And the guidance issued initially by the EU and subsequently also by the UK at the time didn't clarify that at all. And you're absolutely right. With a little bit of pressure from the CBAM and also from us and through some colleagues of ours in Brussels, we managed to get some clarity, certainly on the EU measure.
So it seems to me that we've got, with both of these measures, a set of regulations that have been introduced by, and I'll use the word authorities because it's not just the British government. Obviously, this is the EU too, and really taking the lead, introduced with the best intentions, CBAM, to actually protect the regime of a low carbon future. And in the case of Russian sanctions, obviously to execute and to make sure that sanctions against Russia are working effectively. That hasn't been thought through enough to actually think through the unintended consequences. If it has been thought through, it probably just hasn't been thought through enough, and it's not being communicated properly. Would you agree?
I don't think anybody would argue about the intentions behind both measures, but you're absolutely right. I don't think a great deal of thought has been given to the additional burden on business, and particularly in the UK for British exporters and those exporters to the EU. This is going to add cost and time into supply chains and potentially wastage in terms of product which can no longer be shipped because it offends the sanctions.
There's so many questions we have left unanswered. As the legislation comes in, we're kind of almost playing catch up. And I think the EU have probably got their act together, but we haven't. The gap is too big. We've got to have the EU, which is our biggest export market by a long way. And we've got to have them a lot closer, work a lot closer with them and understand what legislation they're bringing in. And I think CBAM is probably going to be worse than the Russian sanctions, which is frightening.
Yeah, because the EU-Russian sanctions, I guess, well, one would hope would be for a relatively short space of time, but CBAM is going to be a permanent thing, isn't it? It's only going to be increasing. And to touch on your point, it's almost like a bit of an experiment at the moment. It will only get bigger, not smaller.
Well, and we also see that the UK are likely to be introducing a CBAM of its own. Now, the extent to which we learn from the experience of the EU's experiment or whether we go down a completely different route remains to be seen.
Yeah, and of course you might have a CBAM that's different for every export market and state market and actually would cause quite a bit of attrition in a period of time where actually doing international trade is actually being more actively encouraged.
This started on October the 1st, so we've got members who should be collating data. It's how do we collate it, what form they want it in. We can't answer them questions because we don't really know. And we've still got a series of webinars planned on our own, but also with Crowe, to try and give our members and other people more information about exactly what's required.
So apart from perhaps looking on the Crowe website at the customs hub, where it talks a lot about both the Russian sanctions and CBAM, if you're interested in looking at it. The other key message is if you're not a member of the Confederation of British Metalformers, I'd seriously consider it, because your organisation got us involved from a very early stage. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in today, and please, if you've got some benefit from this, share it with all of your networks. It's important that subjects like this get out there to help people. That's why we do them. And please look out for future Crowe Corner as we seek to help business get back on track.